Predators Protector runs out of excuses, and 4 years of breakthroughs in fight against the money power. Coming up on today's show. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 16th of December 2021. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today is Citizens Party Research Director Robert Barwick. Welcome.
Thanks, Lisa. Last show of the year.
That's it. And on today's show we're going to be talking about yesterday's fiery Senate inquiry, the third of the hearings on the Sterling First issue, and about actually a bit of a rundown of the last 4 years of interventions we've made in terms of Senate inquiries and legislation we've got up, and the next phase of what we'll be doing. Now, don't forget, if you like the show, hit the like button, subscribe and ring the notification bell, and you'll be alerted of new shows coming up, and share as widely as you can. Now, one notice before we get into the first topic.
Julian Assange. We put out a press release this week in response to the ruling in the United Kingdom upholding the United States appeal against the blocking of his extradition. So now it goes back to another court. This is ridiculous. We've called on Australia's political leaders to grow a spine and demand Biden release him. Right? He is a journalist who exposed. The only crime he did was he exposed war crimes, but the war crimes our side committed. Right? That's what he did. And they are determined to kill him. They are punishing him. They're persecuting him to death, and they're making an example of him. There's a growing revolt, though. This week, Barnaby Joyce, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Chair of the National Security Committee of Cabinet, he wrote an article saying he's got to be released, brought back to Australia. Anthony Albanese is saying this. So we often on this show, Elisa, give people marching orders. Please, here's something you can do. We don't have any relating to all those various inquiries we've been involved in this year, except for those who are, we've still got, well, by the time people see this, it'll be over. The 18th of December, in 2 days' time, is the deadline for submissions to the Regional Banking Task Force, right, on a postal bank. But what you can do, as we encourage in the press release, and have a look at it, we'll put the link below, make phone calls to Scott Morrison's office, Maurice Payne's office, the Foreign Minister, and the Defence Minister, Peter Dutton, and get angry, demand they tell the Americans, let him go, right? Because if they don't, we're watching an Australian who should be a hero for what he exposed. We're watching him be sacrificed to our supposed security relationship, right? It's like the man in the iron mask, and the man in the iron mask, he had to be kept in the dungeon, in the iron mask, because for security of France, right? That's what's happening with Julian Assange. He's our man in the iron mask. He has to be kept in the dungeon so that to support our security relationship with the United States. No, it's wrong. And so please do something about it. Our
government demanding this of the US would make and should make a big difference. This is our great ally, right? Yeah, okay, yeah. So let's take advantage of that. All right, first topic. Predators Protector runs out of excuses. Now we're talking about the Predators Protector is Mr. Joe Longo, the head of ASIC, and this is in the ongoing inquiry, as we mentioned, into Sterling First, which you can find out more about. We've talked a lot about it on the show, so most people are probably aware this was a scheme whereby a lot of elderly people engaged in a forward payment of rent to a company that was going to allow them to live in their home until they passed away, and then the money goes to their families and so forth. What they were actually getting sucked into was a complex managed investment scheme. We've just put up a new video on this subject which puts it to you in a nutshell, so watch that and circulate it as widely as you can, because this story is the tip of a major iceberg.
Well, that's what the video is called, Sterling First, the tip of the iceberg.
And boy, did that come out in yesterday's hearings. So yesterday was a third in the series of hearings of this Sterling First inquiry, and it came about because during the course of the inquiry there was a demand for certain documents regarding ASIC's treatment of this case, and they were released after the previous set of hearings. So people like Longo had to be held answerable to what came out of those documents. So this is what came up yesterday.
let me preface the importance of this for the viewer, right? Just say this is a football show, talking about football. And just say the overwhelming issue with the football code, and everyone knows it, is that the umpires get bribed, but no one wants to talk about it. But if everyone knows that, we know that the discussion we're having about who's winning, who's not winning, is a joke, unless you address that, right? Or just say, go watch The Untouchables, as we talked about a few weeks ago, the movie about Elliot Ness taking on Al Capone. And what was the number one issue that he had to get around? The cops in Chicago were on Al Capone's payroll. That was the issue. Until that was addressed, nothing was going to happen, right? And that's what the movie's about. Well, your life, your economic life in Australia, as Australian citizens, you're just trying to go about your life and get ahead as well as possible, make sure that when you earn your money and you put it in the bank, everything can be safe, etc. You know there's certain umpires called regulators, right? And you assume they do their job to make sure the system works honestly. And they don't. And that's why what we're talking about with Sterling first is the tip of an iceberg. This case blows the whole system and the way it works wide open. But it's relevant to everybody. It's relevant to the daycare carer. It's relevant to the grandma who's deciding whether to move into a retirement home. It's relevant to everybody in between. All right, so understand that. And then, Elisa, if people did understand that, I'll tell you what is, once you know the right places in the system to look at in terms of how the system's really run, and you get these inquiries, and you get these people whose personal attitudes and decisions shape the system, such as Joe Longo, you get them on the stand, and you can see how they really think, how it really ticks. It's actually quite dramatic. It's gripping to watch these kinds of hearings, and we'll put some links to yesterday's hearing below, but we're going to play a clip. But anyway, it was the third hearing, and as you said, it came about because there was this release of documents. The overall hearing included people like Mrs. Denise Brayley, the champion of the victims, the Sterling First victims. She founded the Banking and Financial Consumer Support Association decades ago, and she knows ASIC better than anybody in the world, right? And so, you know, she gave, her testimony was devastating. She laid out the financial crime that was committed, an absolute crime which ASIC was looking the other way on. They heard from the former head of ASIC, actually, Tony D'Aloisio, and his contribution was more about, okay, here's how I think, from my experience, a regulator should be run, and this is where ASIC is not up to, based on the law, the policy of the government, you know, because the government has this commitment to caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. You want to have a free market system where it's every man for himself. That's actually the government's philosophy, and that was reflected in the hearing. He's saying, you know, the bigger problem here is not the specific decision making at ASIC, even though that is a problem. The bigger problem here is the policy of the government, and that was quite useful. The Financial Planners Association testified. The tenancy lawyers from WA, because a lot of these victims are in WA around Mandurah, the tenancy lawyers testified, etc. But the big testimony was, again, the third appearance of ASIC, the regulator, led by the new chairman, Mr. Longo. And so we're going to play a couple of clips because I can't do justice. You know, the viewer will understand, you know, for someone like me who follows the hearings closely, you know, I'll appreciate all the nuances, they won't. So I'm thinking, how do I best display what this hearing was about for ASIC? What does this hearing show in terms of the way ASIC operates? Well, this is a clip comprised of little snippets of ASIC's testimony over the three hearings, right? And you'll see pretty quickly where ASIC's coming from.
Can I be very clear with the committee? I'm not here to make excuses for any missteps. And I'm not trying to make excuses. As I say, I really want to stress to the inquiry, I'm not trying to make excuses. And I keep stressing, I'm not trying to make excuses. Again, I'm not trying to make excuses. Senator, I'm not trying to make excuses. I'm just trying to sort of work through what we did.
And that's it. That's where ASIC's coming from. There's 140 odd elderly people. They're very elderly. They're vulnerable. A lot of them are sick. 18 have already died since this collapsed. They're facing eviction onto the street. A bunch of them have terminal illness. They're all ruined. They're going to lose everything. And ASIC and that chairman, Joe Longo, is more intent on covering ASIC's butt, because every time he said that, he was absolutely making an excuse. And
at one point, he even said, this is a big hearing for a small number of victims. I think the character of Mr. Longo, I mean, I don't want to say too much. It's not very impressive, to be honest. We knew that he was brought, the Financial Review earlier in the year said, after Josh Frydenberg railroaded James Shipton and Daniel Crennan out of ASIC because they were actually taking on the banks and insisting the banks should fear the regulator, he railroaded them out, and the Financial Review said that in Mr. Longo, Josh Frydenberg has brought back the business-friendly regulator he craves. Right? That's who Mr. Longo is. He's a protector of the system. He's a gatekeeper for this system. Yep. They don't want to change the system. And so they are happy to watch these 140 victims fall off the cliff to their absolute devastation and ruin and early death for a bunch of them, rather than change ASIC. And every time he said, I'm not making excuses, that's all he did in the 3 hearings. The other thing he did, like you said, he was indignant that they're even having the hearings. He said that this is a lot of effort for just a small handful of victims. Now, that's a bit of perspective for you right there. He's saying 100 to 140 victims is small. And that did come out in the hearing. They get 10,000 complaints a year. Yeah. That's how corrupt the system is. And all the ASIC people do is try, how can we ignore these complaints? Right? Australia is a paradise for white-collar criminals, a former ASIC guy said, and they're determined to keep it that way. An insider in Parliament said to me this week, Joe Longo's job is the pendulum swung that way after the Royal Commission. His job is to swing it back. Right? And that's what he's doing to the detriment of these victims. And he was complaining about how much time he's personally had to spend on this one case since he came in, because he's only He's been there 6 months or so, right? And this has dominated his time. You know what that means? Pat you on the back, pat me on the back, every single viewer pat yourself on the back. Because we did this. We got involved with it. These victims, bless their hearts, they are fighters. They hung on for 2 years. Denise Brayley is a warrior, and she led them for the last 2 years. And she tried to tell me last year about this, and we'll talk about this in a minute. We're all tied up with Australia Post, etc. But once we started looking at this, we thought we've got to get involved, right? And once we got involved, and a lot of other people helped make phone calls, etc., and we got this inquiry, this has ruined his year. And I'm glad about that. So, just one other thing before we play the next clip. He also insisted again and again and again that these victims are investors. Now, as you said earlier, they didn't know they were investors. This is the problem is, you can call them, yes, they were technically investors. They were duped. They were drawn into something they had no clue about. And what's the proof of that? There's 2 proofs of that. It came out of the hearings yesterday. There's no financial planners involved. I went to a financial planners conference last week to address them on some of our policies, and one of the things they told me about is every time there's a financial scandal, ASIC looks for the financial planners to blame, because they're at the bottom of the rung, and ASIC just tries to put the blame on the financial planners. There's no financial planners involved in this. None of these victims were represented by a financial planner. Why?
Why? Because they weren't investors. All they thought they were doing was paying rent in advance for the rest of their life. Right?
Why would you go to a financial planner?
Exactly. And then ASIC said in the hearing yesterday, and for some reason, we talk about how one of their defences of themselves, they said, look, if this was such a big problem, why didn't any of the victims complain until it collapsed? They didn't complain because they didn't know they were in this trap.
They didn't complain to ASIC, which is the Securities and Investments Commission, because they weren't investors.
They were just living their life in their houses until it all collapsed, and suddenly no one's paying their rent anymore, and they're thinking, how'd this happen? They didn't know. And he knows that, but he's determined to throw them under a bus, and by insisting they're investors, that it excludes them from the government's compensation scheme, right? Which is a disgusting approach. But
he's not making excuses.
But he's not making excuses. Clearly he was, but then this happened in the hearing, and I'll just set it up. So, One Nation Senator Malcolm Roberts he's been in politics long enough where he's actually participated in other hearings over the years to do with financial victims. He actually conducted an inquiry himself with Wacker Williams in 2016. You might remember Wacker Williams was a National Party senator who got the Royal Commission up. So Malcolm Roberts has seen this before, and most of the time this inquiry has been conducted by 2 senators. Malcolm Roberts participated, and he began a line of questioning to Joe Longo that was based on those documents you mentioned. He was actually the only one to systematically go through them, right? And so he makes it clear to Mr. Longo, he's going to go through those questions, and I'll let you watch it. We're going to play a slightly lengthy clip here. The reaction you see from Mr. Longo was unprecedented in this whole hearing. He is clearly alarmed at where the line of questioning is going, and it gets a bit messy. But watch it for yourself and see what you think.
Thank you, Mr. Longo and your colleagues from ASIC. Mr. Longo, would you agree that for buyer beware to work, buyers need to have access to all available information?
The general principle, buyer beware, availability and also asking. Yeah. So the information, clearly, as your question proposes, information needs to be made available. But the classic application of the buyer beware principle is the buyer also has to ask questions and take an active interest in ensuring they're properly informed before doing things.
Thank you. Before getting to my core questions, I need to reference information contained in the redacted internal ASIC chronologies that were provided to the Senate. I know some of the details have been laboured over, yet I need to reiterate them for the purpose of these questions. So firstly, 4 points. In May 2015, ASIC concluded internally that Sterling had likely provided financial services while unlicensed. Secondly, Sterling had likely not provided adequate documentation to retail investors. Thirdly, Sterling had likely engaged in misleading and deceptive conduct. And fourthly, Sterling may have breached the requirement to not engage in conduct liable to mislead the public. Are these details correct or substantially correct?
Mr. Longo, do you want me to take that?
I was just talking to my general counsel. Go for it, Reece.
So yes, that's a reference to an early complaint we received. The first one we received, which was from FOS. At that time, it appeared to be one breach without any prior or later concerns. It was about a 3-year-old breach already at the time. And in the circumstances, with a myriad of other complaints and referrals we had, we formed the view that no further action was needed at that time.
So they're correct. Thank you. So despite these conclusions, ASIC elected to not pursue an investigation at that time due to the age of the conduct and the other workloads, etc. So continuing to check my understanding, in June 2015, an ASIC staff member raised fresh concerns about Sterling providing unlicensed financial advice or that it may be engaged in misleading or deceptive conduct. And secondly, and the last fact I want to check is that in September 2016, ASIC received a complaint that a Sterling victim had concerns about misleading and deceptive conduct and was unable to get information about what had happened to their investment and could not withdraw their investment as they had been led to understand that they could. Are those 2 points correct?
That is a slight simplification, but yes, basically they are the second and third complaints that we received. They're referred to in our submission as well, Senator.
Yeah, thank you. So,
Senator, can I just ask, the line of questioning is rather, these points have been dealt with comprehensively in our written material, and I would respectfully ask that the approach, the rather simplistic approach that I'm hearing this afternoon, the committee can inspect a supplementary written submission to comprehensively deal with the inferences it appears you wish to draw. But these matters have all been dealt with comprehensively in our written submissions, questions on notice, and do not change my earlier evidence that I believe ASIC behaved reasonably at all material times. I do respect the line of questioning, that I would ask the committee to expect a supplementary submission to confirm the position we've taken on these earlier reports that I believe were properly handled at the time. Thank you.
Thank you for repeating that conclusion from yours. In January 2017, ASIC assumed that Sterling's conduct fell within the small-scale offer exception for professional investors, despite a track record of complaints relating to retail investors. ASIC suspected that a new and ongoing managed investment scheme was in operation. A managed investment scheme was in operation. And despite all of this, ASIC recommended that no further action be taken in relation to Sterling. Did ASIC commence any type of investigation before concluding no further action was required? And if so, specifically, what investigation steps?
Through the chair, could I ask Senator Roberts to ask a question, please?
Yes, I just did. Did ASIC commence any type of investigation?
Quite a narrative that preceded your question, which makes it very hard to answer the question fairly, given the premises upon which it's based, which that are very hard to follow.
Certainly, Mr. Longo. Certainly, Mr. Longo. I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, this is what I asked.
Senator Roberts, if you can, just to make it as easy as possible for us all to follow, if you can really just go through the introductory points one by one that set up your question, just so we can understand the preamble to give the context to our witnesses from ASIC. So sure. Over to you.
Sure. What I'll do, Chair, is I'll address Mr. Longo's request and ask the question, and then go through the introductory comments. The question is, did ASIC commence any type of investigation before concluding that no further action was required? And if so, specifically, what investigation steps? Now, some of the earlier comments were... At what point in
time are you asking me the question that we took no action? At what point in time are we talking about?
Okay, thank you. So what we're looking at here is trying to get an understanding, because I work for the people of this country and I serve them. They pay my salary, they elected me, and I have to serve them. And I think that's what all members of the public service have to do as well, including members of ASIC. So what we need to understand is, what does ASIC see as the breaches? Were there breaches of law? Were there breaches of good faith? What's the core issue? Is it capacity of ASIC? Is it capability of ASIC? Is it structural? Is it a legislative or parliamentary fix? What's the intent going on here? So that's overall where I'm heading, because I can either help you or undermine you.
And I had to include. I cut a little bit there and jumped to that part where Malcolm reiterates why he's asking these questions, and that ASIC too serves the people of Australia, right? Because that's what he was getting. Joe Longo was acting like a defendant lawyer in a court case, whose job is to run interference with the prosecutor, say, you know, objection, 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 right? He was trying to muddy the water. All Malcolm Roberts was trying to go through the documents that ASIC was forced to hand over by the Senate, and those documents show how badly they failed, right? This ASIC has clearly run out of excuses. We now have to see what the final report will be. It's possible there'll be more of this early in the new year. Yeah,
two things. One, ASIC mentioned or mooted a potential supplementary submission, which would raise further questions. So that raises the issue of further hearings. And secondly, I was just going to make the point that if all Longo's defences of ASIC are genuine and correct, oh my God, the system is worse than what we thought, basically. It's thoroughly broken. No, you're right. They can't have it both ways. They got 10,000 complaints a year. Yep. They cursorily assess each of them and move on. You know, it's 10 to 5, as someone joked in our office, and like, oh, that claim now, we'll just dismiss that one. Let's move on. So yes, this system is broken, and of course, what we're going to talk about in the next topic is how to change that. Yep. So 4 years of breakthroughs in fight against the money power. You were looking back over this when you spoke at the Financial Planners Association event last week, and realised that we'd actually in the last 4 years achieved 6 inquiries, Senate inquiries, that would not otherwise have taken place. Yep. So they included in 2017 a Senate inquiry into the bail-in legislation. Well, and bear in mind, we say 4 years because it is exactly 4 years. You and I are recording this on the 16th of December,
by the time it's posted on YouTube, it will be the 18th of December. And remember, 4 years ago, the 18th of December was the deadline for the submissions to the first hearing we achieved, which was the hearing into the bail-in law, right? Financial sector legislation amendment, crisis resolution powers and others measures bill, right? And Doug Mitchell in our office, one of our activists, he had on a lazy Friday afternoon, the government released this bill at that time, knowing that no one would be paying attention, not knowing that some random guy in a Coburg office in Melbourne would be seeing it on his computer screen, and Doug forwards it to me and says, "Robbie, is this bail-in?" Because we had done so much work on bail-in going back 7 years to 2013 when it first happened in Cyprus, where you can take a portion of people's bank accounts to prop up failing banks. And we had done an investigation then, and that investigation revealed there was plans for bail-in legislation in Australia. We'd been on the lookout for it for 7 years, right? And so this was 3 years later, well, for 3 or 4 years by then. And Doug saw it, and Doug saw the language and said, "Is this bail-in?" And we looked at it and we saw that it had this loophole language in it, right? That conversion and write-off of instruments can apply to bonds or any other instrument. And we thought, well, that's really, really broad language. If that's cash deposits in banks, right, that's bail-in. And that led to, we got an inquiry up into the bill. And that's when we met Senator Hume.
Yes, Senator Jane Hume, the Senator for Bankers, led that inquiry, and she also led another inquiry which got going the following year into Glass-Steagall. We had Bob Katter, MP for Kennedy, who tabled our legislation for Glass-Steagall to stop banks speculating. Any deposit-taking bank cannot engage in speculation because it risks the money.
And Elisa, that came out of the fact that after Hume conducted the bail-in inquiry, she was one of only 8 senators present in the chamber when they rushed the bail-in bill into law, and everyone was shocked about that, and we publicised that. And I had first met Bob Katter. I met Bob Katter that evening. The night before, but it had already passed the House because he's in the House, and he said, "Well, what can we do?" And I said, "What you can do is come up with the antithesis to bail-in, which is Glass-Steagall. Separate the banks so they don't get into trouble in the first place." Yeah. And he was happy to do it. So he introduced the bill in 2018, and then Pauline Hanson reintroduced it in 2019 in the Senate, and we got an inquiry up into that.
In 2019, that's right. And then the cash ban bill was the next one, which there was a Senate inquiry in 2019. We had, in combination with a whole host of other forces across the country, it was a massive campaign. That was defeated, and they dropped the bill by the end of 2020. We'll put up the Sydney Morning Herald headline declaring it dead, dead, dead.
That was a huge victory, and it's probably, in recent years, it's probably the biggest clear victory that we've had. There was an activist involved in anti-money laundering, tipped off John Adams, the economist, former Liberal Party advisor. John Adams tipped off me. Our organisation went on a huge mobilisation. John Adams and Martin North on their channel, Interest of the People. Martin North's channel, Walk the World, he got me on there. For a long time, his interview with me on that channel was the biggest interview he ever did. A lot of people paid attention to the cash ban. We got an inquiry. The Labor Party was going to tick off support for it. Instead, we turned everything around. We flooded an initial consultation with the greatest amount of submissions they've ever received. And then that led to a Senate inquiry, and we got that up. And I think I might have mentioned it on the show last week because the late Senator Alex Galagher has only recently died. But there's a video on YouTube. You can go and find that video of Alex Galagher, the Labor Party Senator from South Australia, asking all the government departments in a row in December 2019, where's the evidence for this cash ban? And none of them can give him any. And that was the beginning of the end for the cash ban. Still took a year for the government to withdraw the bill, right? But they'd never seen a grassroots reaction like it.
Yeah, and we saw Liberals revolting against their own government, which of course has been escalating over the recent couple of years.
And just underscore, these inquiries are not bureaucratic exercises. If you pay attention to, I met a 20-year-old in Newcastle last week at a bar because he'd seen me on YouTube. He wanted to meet me, and he had other interests, and we were discussing that. But then he told me how, because he's come around us, he's paid attention to the Sterling First thing, which in any other universe he would have no interest in something that relates to a bunch of elderly people in Western Australia, and he's in Newcastle in New South Wales. But he found the hearings gripping because he paid attention to the details, because what you see is you force these decision makers to account for themselves. And it's actually a great way to directly participate through our democratic processes, and the cash ban was the best one, right? It just ripped the mask off this agenda and they couldn't go anywhere with it.
Yep. Now in February 2020, we put up with Senator Malcolm Roberts, One Nation Senator, the amendment to amend the bail-in legislation that we talked about before. Yes. And that led to an inquiry into whether that was necessary, which recommended against the legislation, that inquiry. Meanwhile, people like John Hewson were saying it's a no-brainer to have legislation like this. However,
John Hewson said that, and the best part of that inquiry is a former director of the Australian Banking Association, who's also a former senior advisor to John Howard, actually, came out saying, essentially, those of us who think this is a bail-in law are right. He confirmed we were right.
Yeah.
It led to a vote. It's the first time we've actually achieved a vote in Parliament on one of these bills. Now, it was voted down, but because there was a senator on the Liberal side going to cross the floor, Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison had a panic attack, and they said, well, hang on, don't cross the floor, what can we do? And that there's now, it's not complete, but there's an ongoing negotiation behind the scenes to come up with a way to amend that bail-in law to exclude deposits from any bail-in. Because that's the government's position. They claim that their law won't exclude deposits. We say it's not clear enough, and there is a process of trying to resolve that behind the scenes that's still ongoing now.
Now, then we had the campaign earlier this year, which feels like it was an eternity ago, but the Australia Post Christine Holgate affair had come to a head, of course, at the end of last year. And so we forced that to an inquiry because of her dismissal and the way that it occurred, with the Prime Minister dictating in the Parliament that she must go.
And remember how that came about, because this is an example where it really does come down to the Citizens Party and our supporters. Really uniquely. Nobody was interested in that. Nobody was interested in defending a fat cat bureaucrat who'd given away gold watches. How dare she? And I saw the licensed post office group, who are the small business franchisees who run post offices around Australia. I saw their leader, Angela Cramp, in the press saying Christine Holgate was the best CEO Australia Post ever had. And I thought, this does not compute.
Yeah.
I couldn't... Scott Morrison's performance in the Parliament that day was so over the top. I thought, that stinks, and I heard that. And I called them up, and they told me their side of it, that one, it had happened 2 years earlier when everyone was acting like she'd just given away these gold watches in the middle of the COVID pandemic. No, it happened 2 years earlier. But then it happened because she took on the banks and made them pay more money. And as soon as and we knew that also that she supported the postal bank. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, of course she's made herself an enemy of the banks. And then the other picture to emerge was that she was also the main obstacle to the government's long-standing agenda to privatise Australia Post. And we just kept publicising that. We changed public opinion. It led to the inquiry. What did the inquiry achieve? It killed the privatisation agenda dead, completely dead. Right now, that's politically impossible. It did help her clear her name. Unfortunately, we couldn't get her job back, but it did help her clear her name. But that's what we achieved out of that. And now we're going to make sure that that turns into a bigger fight for a postal bank.
Yeah. Just number 6 on that list to mention was the Sterling First inquiry, but we've already covered that. But coming back to the postal bank, because this is what we want to talk about next. Look, this is the big issue that terrifies the banks and the global banking fraternity, and therefore it's the big issue that we need to fight on in this next year. We have legislation prepared and ready to go, which MP Bob Katter will table at the first opportunity, to bring back essentially what the old Commonwealth Bank used to be. And you can read in the latest Australian Alert Service, and contact us for a complimentary copy if you've never read one before, about the Commonwealth Development Bank, which was shuttered by the same Campbell Committee inquiry in the early 80s that defined the system today, which has done over these 140 elderly Sterling First victims, because it defined the efficient markets, deregulated system, and it also deliberately dismantled the Commonwealth Credit Development Bank. Commonwealth
Development Bank. And the Commonwealth Bank.
And the Commonwealth Bank was privatised as a result of that, because that inquiry basically stated public banking is off the agenda. You can also read from another standpoint of importance to our campaign in the lead of this Australian Alert Service that the issue of national banking is critical to stabilise our economies that are facing an economic breakdown after 3 to 4 decades of neoliberalism and are facing a new global financial crisis which will be unprecedented in a similar way to that prior to both previous world wars we were facing global financial crisis. Everyone knows in the lead up to World War II, the 1929 Great crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that ensued. But also prior to World War I, there was a similar financial breakdown that also precipitated a geopolitical crisis. And what we're seeing today is a similar geopolitical situation where the dominant countries who dominate the current economic framework see that they're losing control of that system and they will do anything to defend it. So we need to bring the issue of national banking right back to centre stage. Now, it's been at centre stage. There's actually been a lot of inquiries, whether it be on farming and credit for farming, whether it be on manufacturing, small business, and we've covered some of them in this week's alert service. And constantly people will raise, we need a bank that will specially cater for small business, that'll specially cater for these areas of the economy that we need to foster. Yep. And look, in 2017, in the lead up, as the Royal Commission, the Banking Royal Commission was brewing and these issues were being raised, you had people like Bill Shorten call for a government manufacturing bank. You had Small Business Ombudsman Kate Carnell calling for a government bank for small business. Even then, Treasurer Scott Morrison called for an affordable housing finance corporation. These were all somewhat modelled on the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is the only government or one of a couple of government development banks that function in that way by putting credit into a certain area, in that case to foster renewable development. In 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, we put out a call, Citizens Party, for that bank to be co-opted to fund infrastructure on an urgent basis.
We wanted it. It's there. It's the credit. Has the credit mechanism. Expand it for a massive redevelopment of Australia in the context of the Depression.
George Christensen in 2020 called an inquiry in the Parliament into diversifying our trade and investment. They proposed a government development bank to fund manufacturing and so forth. The government just responded to that in August. And they said they noted that recommendation, but that it would be best to evaluate the government's success in its current 10-year modern manufacturing strategy before considering a development bank to invest in Australia's manufacturing capacity. So and there you have it. That's how they always end.
And that modern manufacturing strategy is worth something like $1.5 billion. It is pennies compared to the pounds that are actually needed. But if we had them, we could transform the country. And that's what a bank can provide. The principle here, if people aren't clear on it, why do the private banks hate a public bank so much? Banking is powerful, right? The power to create credit, you can read histories about it, and people, even the bankers themselves say, man, if people knew we can create credit, it's actually not that mysterious. It seems mysterious, and it's a legitimate power. The power to create credit is a legitimate power. And the private banks want it as a monopoly. Because if governments use it for the public good, to build infrastructure, invest in the important industries that the private banks aren't that interested in investing in, etc. You sort of rip the mask off these private bankers, and you realise, hang on, they just use this power for their own ends to steal from us all, essentially, right? Whack us with big interest bills and all this kind of stuff. It doesn't need to be done that way. Banking can be controlled, and where the power is, there's still the power there, but do it in a controlled way, right, where it benefits everybody. People can still profit, but it's got to serve the economy, right? Not be the master of the economy. And that's why they're not going to voluntarily do it, Elisa. You got to have a public option because the government owns the public bank and the government's accountable to us. Right?
And that's why Christine Holgate proposal for a postal bank, in a nutshell, was a terrifying thing.
And one of the reasons that the financial crisis turned into war, as you are indicated, is because, yeah, it becomes, the financial crisis means there's something wrong with the economic system of one or more sides, right? And they want to defend this money power. The money power is the private vested interests who control banking. And right now the target is China. But China's not a communist country anymore. It is by name, not by its economy. But you know what's at the core of that economy? 4 very big, very powerful government banks, public banks. So yeah, they're a capitalist economy in many respects, but at the engine is a system where the money is under the control of the government that's accountable in their way to the people.
And that was modelled on something devised by the Americans in opposition to the British free trade imperial system. So you can find out more about all of this. Subscribe to our Australian Alert Service. You can join us as a member. We've, can't get time to talk about all of it, but we'll put the relevant links below. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and
call those. We'll put the link below to the press release. Call the ministers about Julian Assange. Put in your, well, you probably already have, but follow these inquiries that we've got up, including the Regional Banking Task Force, which is a very important one. And what else? Merry Christmas.
That's it for this week. Thanks, Robbie.
When are we back?
We're back on the 15th of January, so we'll see you. Won't see you next week. We'll see you then.
See you then.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.